Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we dive into some of the world's most complex topics, try to cut through all that noise, and really give you the playbook you need to be properly informed.
And today, we're jumping into decision intelligence. It's a field really pioneered, you could say founded by Cassie Kozyrkov.
Right.
And our mission here, it feels particularly critical right now, doesn't it? With just this flood of information everywhere. We need to get our heads around how this discipline fundamentally changes the game.
Changes the focus, you mean?
Exactly. Away from just, gathering and looking at data towards actually figuring out your priorities first. And then, crucially, taking thoughtful action based on them.
So if you're out there, maybe in your organization, feeling like you're just drowning in data lakes, building these honestly beautiful dashboards, but nothing actually changes, then this deep dive is definitely for you.
We're kicking this whole thing off with a statement that, well, it sounds pretty counterintuitive, maybe even a bit shocking, especially today.
Okay, let's hear it. What's the hook?
The hook, the sort of central idea of decision intelligence is this. Data is pretty, but not important.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that definitely lands strangely. Pretty, but not important. In this world, obsessed with data.
It feels almost like heresy, right? Particularly now with generative AI churning out unbelievable amounts of text and information and this constant drumbeat about big data.
So unpack that for us. Why pretty? Why not important?
Well, the core point we really need to get into is this. In a world where getting information is cheap, almost free, and it's everywhere, the data itself isn't the scarce resource anymore.
What is that?
Purpose. That's the scarcity. Knowing what you actually want to achieve in the first place and then being able to articulate that clearly enough so you can make choices that really have a high impact.
Okay, so this deep dive is basically our roadmap to help us navigate this information glut.
That's the goal, moving beyond just hoarding data because, well, you can.
Yeah, storage is cheap.
Right. And instead, figuring out how to actually harness it so you become the driver of your own decisions, not just a passenger reacting to the data stream.
I have to say, that origin story for this philosophy, it's really compelling. The idea that it's rooted in just the aesthetic pleasure of information.
It really is.
That, quote, data is pretty but not important. It comes from a really personal place, doesn't it? About how the founder first discovered spreadsheets.
It's a fantastic image, yeah. Captures that initial allure of data perfectly. She talks about being, maybe 8 or 9 years old and discovering what she called, I think, the most beautiful thing on the planet, a spreadsheet.
Huh. While other kids were collecting stamps or rocks.
Exactly. She was finding this deep aesthetic joy in just meticulously recording her gemstone collection. It was ordered, it was soothing, perfectly structured.
That really does capture something universal about data's appeal, doesn't it? It's not just about the raw facts, it's the order, the structure.
The control.
Yeah, the feeling of control. It feels like an extension of our senses, almost. Data lets us pay attention to way more complexity, remember things more accurately. You look at a really clean dashboard, and it just feels good. It looks, pretty.
Precisely. It's a beautiful record. It offers a kind of intellectual comfort, But... And here's the crucial pivot in decision intelligence. The real test of whether that data is important, that's conditional.
Okay. Conditional on what?
It's only important if it actually changes how you move through the world. If that perfectly organized spreadsheet, all those details about the gemstones, if they never actually led her to change her trading strategy or look for new stones in a different place, or even just decide which stone to focus on next.
Then it was just a pretty list.
Exactly. Then the data, however beautiful, however soothing, just remained pretty. It didn't cross the threshold into important.
And that feels like the big danger in, say, corporate life today, right? We have so much data, we build these amazing looking systems.
Vanity metrics, often.
Yeah, vanity metrics. Dashboards that glow green. Stunning visualizations. They satisfy that need for order, that aesthetic sense, but they don't actually translate into the organization moving differently.
That is the core pathology, really, of this information age. If all that effort in collecting, cleaning, visualizing, if it doesn't ultimately impact someone's behavior or influence a real-world outcome, maybe change a budget or tweak a product feature, then it's failed the importance test.
So decision intelligence flips that whole script.
Completely. It insists that the starting point has to be the decisions you need to make, the actions you might take, not the data you happen to have lying around.
So you don't start by asking, what data do we have?
No, you start by asking, what decision is on the table right now? And maybe even more critically,
Right.
what evidence would it actually take to change my mind about this decision?
And following that logic, let's say you do all the analysis, build the models, look at the data, and you still end up making the same decision you would have made anyway, like sticking with the old software version. Then arguably, all that effort spent analyzing the data to confirm that, it wasn't actually important work, even if the data itself was perfectly fine.
Exactly right. Importance in this framework is measured purely by the action it enables, the impact it has. The fundamental question decision intelligence forces you, or your organization, to confront is, are you building these beautiful, complex models just for their own sake? Or are you building them specifically to generate actionable evidence? Evidence designed to overcome inertia or drive a specific, probably high-stakes decision.
It shifts the focus then from the output of the data team, like here's our fancy model, to the input required by the leadership team, like here's the evidence you asked for to help you make that call.
Precisely. It puts the decision back at the center.
Okay, so to really get why we're in this situation now, this hoarder's dilemma, as you called it,
Yeah.
we probably need to look back a bit, right, at the history of data itself.
Absolutely, because data science, if you think about it in the broadest sense, really started the moment humans figured out how to write things down.
You mean way back?
Way back. The source material traces data collection right back to the earliest writing systems we know of, things like cuneiform tablets in ancient Mesopotamia.
And the point wasn't poetry back then.
Not at all. Writing was initially a purely practical tool, a memory prosthesis, you could call it.
A memory prosthesis, I like that.
Yeah. It was developed to solve really immediate, complex, real-world problems, like resource management.
Keeping track of stuff, basically.
Yeah.
Who brought in how much grain, who owes who 3 cows, that kind of thing.
Exactly that. It automated memory, which, let's face it, is pretty unreliable on its own. This freed up people's brain power for other things, and importantly, it provided a verifiable record that helped keep society stable.
Okay, but for thousands of years, that data was kind of
Stuck.
right, stuck on clay tablets or papyrus or paper.
Stuck in analog form, yeah. We could copy books, share manuscripts, which was a huge leap in sharing memory, obviously. But there was this fundamental limitation. It's sometimes called the abracadabra problem.
The abracadabra problem. Okay, explain that. It sounds intriguing.
Well, imagine you've got a physical book on your desk. Let's say it's Moby Dick.
Big book.
Big book. Now, you can ask it a question like, hey, book, what's the average sentence length in here? You've asked the question, you've basically said abracadabra. But the book just sits there, can't answer you.
Right, because it's just ink on paper.
Exactly. To get the answer, a human has to do all the hard work, tediously read every sentence, load it into their short-term memory, keep some kind of running tally of lengths, do the math, probably make a mistake somewhere along the way. The physical form, the analog nature of the data, it just resisted any kind of automation or a large-scale analysis.
Until computers came along.
Until electronic form. The second data became searchable, indexable, computable, boom. The abracadabra problem was basically solved. Suddenly, we could ask those complex questions and get the computer to do the toil and torture, as the source puts it, of actually calculating the answer for us.
But that early electronic data, it wasn't like today, was it? It was expensive stuff.
Incredibly precious, yeah. Think back to the 80s, maybe the early 90s. Storage space was ridiculously limited and cost a fortune.
So you couldn't just save everything.
No way. If you were a CTO back then, you had to be ruthless about what you kept. Every single megabyte you stored represented a serious chunk of money. So organizations had this built-in discipline. You only collected data if you had a really clear, defined purpose for it and a plan for how you were going to use it.
Which brings us crashing into today, the hoarder's dilemma. Because now storage is, well, it feels free.
It's effectively free, yeah. And that discipline, it's just evaporated. We've gone from needing to carefully budget for one tiny storage locker to someone basically handing you keys to 20,000 massive warehouses for free.
So why throw anything away?
Exactly. Why bother? So we collect everything indiscriminately, just in case. And we end up with these colossal, often uncatalogued digital landfills of information.
That contrast you mentioned between precious data collection and cheap data collection, that's really key here.
It is. Think about, say, a university doing an fMRI brain scan study. That machine costs millions, right?
Right. And running it isn't cheap either.
So maybe they can only afford to scan, say, 20 participants. Every single minute of that scan time is meticulously planned. every data point collected feels incredibly valuable because the act of collecting it was so expensive and effortful compared to a tech company scraping billions of web pages or passively logging every single click every user makes on their site. The marginal cost of collecting one more click, one more page, it's practically zero.
So the mindset shifts completely.
Totally. With the cheap data, the thinking becomes, we don't need to worry too much about the purpose right now because collecting it costs nothing. We'll figure it out later.
And later often never comes.
Or if it does, you can't find what you need in the giant mess. It really is like that TV show Hoarders, but on a global, digital scale. Information stored just because it exists, not because it serves any defined purpose. And that's precisely why decision intelligence tries to wrench the focus back to action and purpose. Tag 3, the generative AI revolution and the new essential skill.
Okay, so this hoarder's dilemma, this mountain of digital stuff we've collected, it actually sets the stage perfectly for understanding the impact of generative AI, doesn't it?
Absolutely, because if we're sitting on these enormous kind of disorganized piles of data, Gen AI suddenly comes along and says, hey, I can help you sort through that massive storage locker.
So what's it really automating? It's not just finding facts, is it?
No, the fundamental thing being automated here is arguably language understanding itself. Think about it. Historically, if you wanted a machine to do anything useful with information, even just answer a simple question about your data.
Because they speak its language.
Exactly. You had to go through that toil and torture we mentioned, learning an unnatural language. Programming languages like Python or SQL, they're incredibly rigid, super specific, designed precisely to eliminate all the ambiguity that we humans use naturally.
Right. You had to basically contort your human thoughts into this very strict machine-readable logic.
Yeah, it took dedication, specialized skills. It was often described, maybe half-jokingly, as a kind of masochism, forcing your brain into the machine's way of thinking just to get it to do something.
But Gen AI changes that dynamic completely.
It democratizes the whole process.
Yeah.
Suddenly, the barrier to entry just collapses. Anyone who can use natural language, basically, anyone who can type a question or a request in plain English,
Can start asking the machine to sift through that hoard for them.
Precisely. You don't need to spend years learning to code just to start leveraging the power of computation on all this information.
Okay, but that immediately shifts the bottleneck, right? If the machine can now effortlessly find, categorize, summarize, synthesize information from this vast sea of data.
Right. Then the purely technical skill of just accessing the data or manipulating it in basic ways becomes much less valuable.
So the critical human skill, the thing that really matters tomorrow, that has to change too.
It has to. And the argument is the biggest, most essential skill is becoming much more metacognitive. It's about knowing what you actually want in the first place.
Knowing your own goals.
Knowing your goals, and crucially, being able to articulate them clearly, comprehensively, probably iteratively, refining as you go. We're shifting from a world where technical expertise meant knowing the right database commands to a world where expertise is increasingly defined by the quality of your questions, the clarity of your prompts.
So prompt engineering, which sounds quite technical.
At its core, it's really just the skill of articulating your desires, your intentions, perfectly to an intelligent system that can now understand natural language.
Which means, maybe counterintuitively, the focus shifts away from the underlying data the AI was trained on. I mean, that's still important, obviously, but...
Yeah. It's less about the raw material and more about how we interface with the abundance. The machine can give us answers incredibly quickly now, so the scarcity isn't the answer anymore.
The scarcity is the meaningful question.
Exactly. If the answer is cheap and fast, all the human cognitive effort needs to move upstream, to formulating the right clargen, to clarifying our intent with a level of precision we've never really needed before.
Because it's easy to get an answer from Gen AI.
Trivial. The real challenge is expressing your goal so precisely that the answer you get back is actually useful, aligned with what you're trying to achieve, whether that's personal or organizational. It's about learning to steer this abundance, not just getting lost in it.
This brings us neatly to what happens when businesses try to deploy AI, at scale. Not just playing around with chatbots, but integrating it into core processes.
Right, because AI really made the leap from being this theoretical mathematical curiosity to a practical tool, precisely because it could tackle complex, messy, real-world enterprise problems. often the kinds of problems that just defied simple step-by-step instructions written by humans.
So how does it do that? How does it handle that complexity?
Well, the key difference is that AI, especially machine learning, solves problems despite complexity. Traditional programming needs you, the human, to think of every possible rule, every if-then scenario.
Which is impossible for really complex systems.
Exactly. Machine learning instead learns its own recipes. It looks at millions, maybe billions of examples of successful loan applications, of fraudulent transactions, whatever it is, and it figures out the patterns itself. It's not following rules we wrote. It's generating its own internal logic based on the data.
Okay, but that sounds
opaque.
Risky even.
It absolutely introduces risk, opacity, and complexity right into the heart of the business. Because when a system learns from examples, maybe it's an AI deciding which resumes get flagged for an interview, you lose the ability to predict exactly how it will behave in every single edge case. You certainly can't easily explain why it made a particular decision in simple human terms.
So you lose that guarantee of simplicity, that clear line of sight.
You do. And that means the leader, the person ultimately responsible, has to confront what the source material calls one heck of a trolley problem.
The trolley problem, like the philosophical dilemma.
Yeah.
Choose who gets hit by the runaway trolley.
Exactly like that. By choosing to automate core business functions with these complex, opaque AI systems, leaders are knowingly introducing systems that carry inherent risks, moral risks, operational risks, legal risks. They are, in effect, setting a complex trolley in motion without fully knowing where it might swerve.
Can you make that more concrete, like with an example?
Sure. Take a bank using AI for deciding who gets a loan. The CEO, the board, they don't need to understand the, 500 million parameters inside the neural network model. That's impossible. But what they must understand is that the system is complex and operates based on patterns it found, not explicit rules they approved. And therefore, if that system makes a decision that turns out to be unintentionally biased or harmful or just plain wrong in a crucial case,
the responsibility still lands squarely on the human leadership.
Absolutely. The moral and legal accountability doesn't vanish just because the decision was made by an algorithm. The leader has to own the consequences of unleashing that complexity. If the problem was simple enough for clear rules, they would have automated it with simple code 20 years ago. The very fact that they need AI implies the problem is inherently complex, and leaders have to accept the high-stakes consequences that come bundled with that complexity.
Which brings us to that buzzword we hear everywhere. AI first. There's a right way and a wrong way to think about that, isn't there? Especially through the lens of decision intelligence.
Definitely. The wrong way, the trap many fall into, is starting with the technology. We've got this cool new AI hammer. Now let's wander around looking for a nail to hit.
And usually they pick the smallest, least important nail first.
Right. Let's do a pilot project with a chatbot that answers basic FAQs. It feels safe, but it completely misses the point. It's finding an excuse to use the tech, rather than using the tech to solve a genuinely important problem.
So what does genuine organizational AI firstness look like if you're guided by DI principles?
It means flipping the script entirely. Leaders need to start by asking the fundamental DI question. What is truly important here? What are the absolute core priorities for this organization? What drives the vast majority of our value or impact?
Okay, start with importance.
Start with importance, and only then ask the crucial follow-up. Okay, given these priorities, what problems related to them used to be completely impossible to solve? But now, with AI, might just be possible. And if they were possible, would that be incredibly useful, maybe even transformative?
So AI first doesn't mean putting AI literally first in the process.
No. It means being willing to use AI to tackle your first-order priorities. It means using this powerful new capability to metaphorically kick down the doors on problems that humanity, or at least your industry, had previously written off as unsolvable.
Like optimizing a massively complex global supply chain in real time. Yeah. Or developing truly personalized medicine based on genomics.
Exactly. Those kinds of grand challenges. True AI firstness for an organization is about having the vision and courage to aim the technology at your biggest, hairiest, most important problems, not just finding incremental improvements for things that were already working okay, like making email drafts slightly better. It's about purpose-driven application, not just implementation for technology's sake.
All right, so we've kind of dissected the problems, the data hoarding, the misguided AI first stuff. Now let's focus on the solution, right? On the individual decision maker. How does decision intelligence actually work in practice?
Well, at its heart, the core principle is really just about sensible living, isn't it? It's about prioritizing your effort, your resources, your attention based on what's actually at stake in a given situation.
That sounds simple, but
It sounds simple, but it's profound. Decision intelligence basically provides the steering wheel for navigating life or business. If you're not actively connecting with your highest priorities, what really matters to you?
you're just drifting.
You're just drifting, floating randomly. You become purely reactive, just a passenger responding to whatever pops up next. DI is the discipline that says, no, you take the wheel. It gives you a framework for consciously choosing how, when, and where to deploy your limited resources, your time, your money, your cognitive energy, and yes, your technical tools like data and AI.
And this focus on the decision maker's mindset, it gets quite specific, doesn't it? There's a structured way to approach choices, starting with this idea of the default action.
The default action, yes, that's absolutely fundamental. It's the bedrock of making a thoughtful judgment call. It's simply defining upfront what you commit to doing if no new convincing information comes along.
It sets the inertia, basically, the status quo.
Precisely. It establishes the baseline. Let's take a big business decision, say, should we switch to this brand new, potentially amazing, but also expensive and unproven manufacturing system?
Okay. High stakes.
High stakes. Your default action needs to be stated clearly right at the start. Maybe it's, unless proven otherwise, we will continue using our existing reliable system. That's your default.
Got it. So you've set the default. What's next?
Now, the decision maker's core responsibility is to define the evidence that would be required to change their mind. What specific level of performance improvement or reliability data or maybe cost savings would it actually take to convince you that moving to the new, risky system is genuinely better than sticking with the safe, known quantity of the old one?
So you're defining the hurdle the new information has to clear.
Exactly. That's the moment decision intelligence really happens. You are consciously, deliberately defining the burden of proof. It forces you to articulate the threshold of evidence needed to overcome the inherent risk and inertia associated with making a change.
And the goal here isn't necessarily finding the single right answer, is it? The founder seems careful about using that word.
Very careful. The objective is described as a thoughtful judgment call, and there's a deliberate avoidance of claiming we should be searching for the objectively right answer.
Why is that? Why shy away from right? It feels like that links back to how statisticians think.
It does. It's a really crucial insight, grounded in statistical thinking. Statisticians, by their nature, deal in probabilities, in confidence intervals, not in absolute metaphysical certainties.
They don't like saying something is 100% proven.
Exactly, because usually it isn't. If you demand the right answer, you're implicitly asking for a level of universal truth that, frankly, no amount of finite data or evidence can ever truly provide. A thoughtful judgment call, on the other hand, acknowledges that all evidence is inherently probabilistic.
So the data might strongly suggest the new system is better.
Right, it might suggest it with, say, 95% confidence, but it will never give you 100% certainty. There's always that remaining uncertainty, that residual risk. And the decision maker's job in the DI framework is to own that uncertainty, to make the call despite it. That ownership, that judgment under uncertainty, is what DI defines as the core of making important decisions.
Okay, this structured approach, default action, evidence threshold, seems perfect for those big, slow, strategic decisions. But what about speed? What about all the faster decisions leaders have to make? When is it okay to just, go with your gut?
That's a great question. And intuition isn't seen as the enemy of decision intelligence. It's actually recognized as a valid and often very powerful way of integrating information.
Yes.
Well, particularly for people with deep domain experience, someone who's seen thousands of similar situations before their intuition is often this incredible, massively parallel processing engine. It's integrating vast amounts of prior data, patterns, and experiences subconsciously.
So forcing them to slow down might actually be counterproductive.
Sometimes, yes. Forcing that expert to stop, articulate a detailed pros and cons list, build a formal spreadsheet, it might actually make them worse at the decision. It forces them onto a slower, more linear processing path, potentially making them ignore subtle cues their intuition picked up. They might end up using less information, not more.
So intuition works best when the current situation feels familiar, when it rhymes with things you've successfully navigated before.
Absolutely. Intuition shines when you have significant, relevant experience, when the challenge you're facing connects strongly to that deep, internal library of patterns you've built up over years.
But there's a warning label attached to that.
A big one. The critical warning is, Be extremely cautious about relying purely on your gut for important, high-stakes decisions in situations where you have never seen anything remotely similar before. If the challenge is genuinely novel, if the stakes are high and your experience base is thin, that's when the formal, technical effort of decision intelligence, clearly defining your default, consciously setting that evidence threshold, becomes absolutely essential to augment your judgment and avoid potentially catastrophic mistakes. #TAG-sex. Addressing cognitive blind spots. The need for augmentation.
And that need for augmentation, for using these DI tools, it really comes down to facing a somewhat uncomfortable truth about ourselves, doesn't it? That humans, well, we're predictably irrational.
Yeah, that's a tough pill to swallow sometimes, but it's crucial. We're amazing creatures in so many ways, but our built-in cognitive systems are definitely not perfect, rational spreadsheets.
That's where fields like behavioral economics really shook things up, right? People like Dan O'Reilly.
Exactly. Behavioral economics became so influential because it systematically uncovered this huge gap. On one side, you had these elegant mathematical theories like, say, auction theory, which describes how a perfectly logical, rational person should behave when bidding.
The ideal human.
The theoretical ideal. And then on the other side, you had experimental economics, which actually went out and tested how real humans actually behave in those same auction scenarios.
And the results were different.
Often wildly different. It showed we have these built-in biases, these predictable ways we deviate from pure rationality. We're flawed, but often flawed in consistent, understandable ways.
I remember seeing examples of those mathematical models for optimal behavior, and then right next to it, the graph of what people actually did in the experiment. It's almost funny how far apart they could be.
It really is, and this cognitive gap shines a spotlight on some of our inherent deficiencies, especially when it comes to things like memory. Our brains just aren't well adapted for persistent, reliable recall, particularly when dealing with large volumes of data or unstructured information.
Right. Like, think about a simple task. If you flashed, say, 50 random numbers on a screen for 5 seconds, and then took them away and asked me for the average,
Well, what happened?
I'd be lost. Completely impossible. My working memory would overload after maybe the first 10 or 15 digits.
Oh.
The rest would just be a blur, or I'd start making them up.
Right. But now what if I gave you a pencil and paper before I flashed the numbers?
Ah, well, then it's easy. I just jot them down as they appeared, then add them up and divide. Simple.
Exactly. But why did it become simple? Because the pencil and paper, a basic tool, a piece of technology, acted as a better memory device for that specific task than your own brain. You use technology to overcome a core human cognitive limitation.
Okay, so data, AI, these structured decision processes like DI, they're essentially serving as an external backup, like an external hard drive for our brain, a memory and attention prosthesis.
That's a perfect way to put it. A memory and attention prosthesis. We use these tools to move beyond this romantic notion that humans are or should be omnipotent or perfectly rational calculators. We acknowledge we can't reliably remember 50 random digits on demand, just like no single CEO can possibly track in their head all the thousands of variables constantly affecting their global business.
So decision intelligence is about being realistic.
It's about being pragmatic. Let's be realistic about these human limitations, these cognitive blind spots, and then let's strategically use technology, data, analysis, AI, to specifically supplement us where we know we are weak.
So using tech to boost our weaknesses, not replace our strengths.
Precisely. Use data to lift ourselves up where we're naturally deficient, like reliable, large-scale memory or unbiased statistical calculation, rather than just using technology to trample all over the things humans are already magnificently good at, like integrating complex, nuanced experience, understanding context, or exercising ethical judgment.
It really reframes it as optimizing the human-machine partnership, understanding what each brings to the table. The human brings the judgment, the priorities, the why. The machine brings the scale, the reliable memory, the computational power.
Exactly. That's the sweet spot decision intelligence aims for. #TAG-7, responsibility, bias, and the who in decision-making. Now, when we talk about setting priorities, making these thoughtful judgment calls, especially when there's uncertainty, we run smack into maybe the biggest variable in the whole equation.
Which is?
The individual human being making the call. Prioritization at its absolute core is a deeply individual act. What you prioritize will always be different, even subtly, from what I prioritize. It's shaped by our unique risk tolerance, our lived experiences, our personal goals, our values.
Which means that the who who is actually in the decision-making seat becomes incredibly important. It's not just about the process or the data.
It matters immensely. If we fall into the trap of pretending that priorities are somehow objective or universal, we might think we can just delegate any important decision to anyone technically competent, or maybe even just hand it off entirely to an AI and expect the same outcome regardless.
But that's a dangerous assumption.
It's fundamentally untrue. The outcome, the actual decision made, hinges critically on the specific individual who is ultimately responsible. Failure can happen not because the data was wrong or the analysis was flawed, but because the person making the final judgment call had, say, a personal aversion to a certain type of risk. Or maybe their definition of what success looked like for that project was different from the organization's overall goal.
Precisely. If you delegate responsibility for a critical decision to someone whose underlying intentions, whose core priorities don't actually align with the overarching goal, you've pretty much guaranteed a suboptimal outcome, maybe even failure, right from the start, regardless of how good the data or the AI model might be. Okay, let's connect this idea that individual priorities are key to the big ongoing conversation about AI bias or algorithmic bias. If individuals set the priorities, and individuals inevitably bring their own perspectives and experiences, does that mean bias is just unavoidable?
Well, the decision intelligence perspective tends to suggest that chasing some idealized state of zero bias is probably a futile effort. Why? Because there simply isn't one single, universally agreed upon, unbiased way to see the world or model reality.
Every choice involves a perspective.
Every single decision we make in building or using these systems, what data should we even collect? Which variable are we trying to optimize? What level of risk is acceptable? What counts as a fair outcome? Every single one of those choices is inherently colored by human judgment, human values, human priorities.
So the goal shouldn't be eliminating bias, because that's impossible.
The goal has to shift towards awareness and accountability.
Okay, what does that look like?
It means we have to focus intensely on choosing thoughtful people to be in charge of these decisions and systems. People who are ideally hyper-aware of their own potential biases, understanding how their background, their experiences might shape their choices. And crucially, people who are genuinely desperately interested in trying to use these powerful tools to make the world better, fairer, more effective, according to some clearly articulated set of values.
So AI bias isn't some magical property of the algorithm itself.
It's fundamentally a reflection of human choices. It reflects how our lived experiences, our priorities, our blind spots get encoded into the data we select, the objectives we set, and the systems we ultimately build. When we audit an AI for bias, what we're really auditing are the human decisions embedded within it, not some autonomous error by the machine.
Let's make this super practical. Imagine a chief data officer brings you in as a consultant. They want help overhauling their whole data strategy using DI principles. You can't start by asking about their databases. So where do you begin?
The very first non-negotiable question is, who is actually in charge here? Who owns the outcome of the decisions this data strategy is supposed to support?
Find the decision maker.
You must identify the ultimate decision maker, the person whose neck is on the line, so to speak. Then you have to map the flow of responsibility around them. Who sets the budget for this initiative? Who gets to define the assumptions about risk tolerance, about the value of different outcomes? Crucially, who defines what success even looks like for this specific project or decision?
And if you skip that step,
you run a massive risk of spending months, maybe years, building a technically brilliant solution to completely the wrong problem, or solving the right problem, but for someone who doesn't actually have the authority or the budget to implement the solution you came up with, it's an enormous waste of resources and effort.
And that key decision maker, the responsible who, they absolutely have to be in the room when those core priorities and assumptions are being defined.
Non-negotiable. It cannot be delegated down the chain or outsourced entirely to the consultants or the data science team. If the people building the models or doing the analysis are left to just guess what the real priorities are or what level of risk the leadership is truly comfortable with,
then they're not just analyzing data, they're implicitly making the strategic decisions themselves.
Exactly. They become the de facto decision makers, often without realizing it. And that's a huge and often very dangerous, unacknowledged transfer of responsibility. So once you've identified the right who, and they've clearly articulated their priorities and constraints, then and only then can the team effectively define the specific evidence needed to support the decision and work backwards from there to figure out the technical process of collecting and analyzing the right data. Decision intelligence demands that the human element, the judgment, the priorities, drives the technical engine, not the other way around.
We started this whole deep dive by talking about data's aesthetic appeal, how it began as a memory prosthesis. But it feels important, as we wrap up, to circle back and also acknowledge its enduring value in a slightly different way.
As a sensory extension, right?
Absolutely. Data, used well, allows us to perceive aspects of reality, patterns, connections that are just completely invisible to our unassisted human senses. We can't intuitively grasp global weather patterns or intricate financial market movements without data.
It lets us see things we couldn't otherwise see.
Exactly. And this long-term perspective forces us to think about something we could maybe call the future robbery.
The future robbery. Okay, intriguing. What do you mean?
Well, if we become too focused only on collecting data that seems strategically important right now, based only on today's priorities and today's questions, we risk inadvertently robbing future generations.
How so?
We deny them the raw material they might need to answer the questions they will find critically important. Questions that we today haven't even conceived of yet. That makes sense. Think about historians trying to understand, say, the Roman Empire. They'd kill for detailed data sets on everyday life that the Romans themselves probably considered completely mundane and not worth recording systematically.
Precisely. A historian looking back at our current era, maybe 500 or 1,000 years from now, will likely be fascinated by aspects of our digital lives, our social interactions, our environmental impact that we currently overlook or consider trivial. If we don't collect and preserve that information now, simply because it doesn't serve an immediate, obvious purpose, those future questions might become unanswerable. The answers are lost forever.
So the fact that data storage has become so cheap and efficient, that's actually a massive long-term benefit, potentially, assuming we manage the downsides, like the environmental cost of all those data centers.
It's a potentially tremendous long-term gift, yes. Assuming we can strike that balance and manage the externalities responsibly. Look, humans are fundamentally a tool-making, tool-using species, and using technology to expand our senses, to expand what we can pay attention to and record. Which is essentially what data collection is. That feels like part of our ongoing historical imperative.
Okay, but then generative AI throws a new wrinkle into this, right?
Yeah.
Because Gen AI is making answers cheap and fast. So just hoarding data for the future isn't quite enough anymore.
Right. It shifts the emphasis again. If getting answers becomes increasingly easy and automated, then the mere act of collecting raw data, while still important for posterity, isn't the whole story. Our ability to formulate good questions becomes even more critical.
Because the AI can answer almost anything, but only if we ask it the right way.
If answers are abundant and cheap, the value shifts dramatically towards articulating high-quality, meaningful, well-defined questions. We need to be incredibly in touch with what we actually want to know, what problems we're trying to solve, so that the answer we get back from the incredibly capable AI isn't just noise. Or worse, a technically correct but practically useless answer, the proverbial 42, like in Hitchhiker's Guide.
Right, the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything, which turned out to be useless because no one knew the actual question.
Exactly that. We need to ensure the answers we get are genuinely meaningful, useful, and actually align with our deeper goals, both present and future.
So it's this constant balancing act. We should probably leverage cheap storage to collect broadly, avoiding that future robbery.
Unless doing so creates, unacceptable environmental damage or other major harms.
Right, acknowledging the trade-offs. But at the same time, we need to invest heavily in the distinctly human skills, the prioritization, the clear articulation of goals, the critical judgment needed to ask the right questions of all that data, both today and to enable better questions tomorrow. #tag outro.
Wow. Okay, so reflecting on this whole deep dive, it feels like decision intelligence isn't just some new buzzword or a minor tweak to data science. It's really presented as a fundamental shift in mindset, isn't it?
It really is. It demands that we stop being passive observers or hoarders of information and become active drivers of our own technological and decision-making destiny.
We have to move away from treating data as this beautiful artifact, pretty, as the quote says, but maybe functionally unimportant if it doesn't lead anywhere.
And instead, learn to leverage it rigorously. Treat it as evidence, specifically gathered or analyzed to fuel deliberate, conscious, high-impact actions.
So the key takeaways for everyone listening seem pretty clear. First, stop obsessing over just collecting more data and start by defining your actual priorities, what decision needs making.
Second, recognize that leadership, especially in this complex AI-driven world, is fundamentally about the who. Who is responsible? Who sets the priorities? Because that individual judgment is paramount.
And third, embrace data and AI not as magic bullets, but as practical, realistic prosthetics. Tools to help us overcome our known, predictable human cognitive blind spots, especially around things like memory, scale, and unbiased calculation.
Exactly. Supplementing our weaknesses, freeing us up to focus on our strengths, judgment, context, ethics, purpose.
Which leaves us with that final, really provocative thought to mull over. Given that data storage is effectively cheap now, and generative AI can give us incredibly fast, comprehensive answers to almost any question we can formulate, it implies the most vital skill isn't necessarily the technical ability to build the AI or manage the database anymore. It's the deeply human ability to clearly articulate what you want and why it truly matters.
So the question for you, listening right now, is how effectively are you defining the questions? The questions that will drive your most important decisions, not just for hitting next quarter's targets, but for shaping the future you and your organization are actively helping to create.